All right, well, thank you very much for the invitation and the introduction. And what I want to do this morning is just to take you on a very brief trajectory from Material Thinking, a book that was written in 2004. And I hasten to add it has been reissued, so no excuses for not getting it, to a book that's just come out called Places Made After Their Stories. The reason for doing that in this context is I hope it illustrates the relationship between methodology and creative research. In other words, rather than think about methodology as something you acquire and then apply, I want to suggest through looking at this 10-year trajectory that it's something that you continually discover along the way. So there's a relationship between the opportunism of the projects or the associations that you make in life and the direction or the emphasis or nuance that's given to what you call your method. And the method is only ever a very flexible, it's a bit like a string figure, it's only a kind of flexible set of reasonably resilient points of critical reflection that guide you on the way. There's a very close relationship in this dynamic model of methodology between the work and the method. To some degree, the work is a working out of the method. So that's the sort of thing I wanted just to share with you, and I'm sure it's an observation that you can apply to your own work. It's a little bit like thinking about your own work, not in terms of individual products, but in terms of the classic oeuvre. You know, what actually is the body of the work, and very often the flesh of the work is between the projects themselves. In relation to the work I want to talk about this morning, I want to sort of emphasize a process of engagement and dispersal. So with Material Thinking, this is a book that came out 10 years ago, and it reflected my own lack of expertise in pretty well any area. The only thing that allowed me to start to work with a sequence of remarkable artists and performers was a sort of cheekiness combined with a sort of colossal ignorance. And it turned out to be quite a good combination of skills. What it meant was that I was able to ask some quite simple questions about technique. There's a chapter in Material Thinking that talks about a collaboration with Charles Anderson, who's one of our RMIT colleagues and a wonderful artist. There's a chapter that talks about John Wolseley, who's a landscape artist and biophilia, if you like, proponent, a wonderful figure. But there are more intimate collaborations with a very famous Bharatanatyam dancer, Chandrabanu, who has a company in Richmond. And there are yet others with institutions. There's a description of working at the Museum of Sydney on soundscapes. I had a background in sound art. But each of these different activities depended on an engagement that, as I say, arose largely from naivety and, of course, an intense curiosity to make things, but certainly lacking the skills to do it. And what emerged from that process, of course, was a question to myself about this kind of promiscuity. How is it that I can be involved in so many different fields and become increasingly interested in processes of composition, production, post-production? What is it that might hold these things together, apart from a certain insouciance in my character? And we were talking earlier on about the question of the relationship between writing and object or post-object production, whatever you want to call it, and that was at the core of it. I did have one, if you like, background skill or orientation, and that was towards poetry. I was keen to understand the relationship between thinking in figurative modes, thinking through metaphor, thinking through, as we do now, through the rhetorical production of sense, to understand better the forms and the means by which these forms appeared. And through that process, I began to not only understand certain commonalities across these very different kinds of work, but also to understand something about the potential of this emerging method, if we can call it that. Certainly it was a style of critical analysis. So in the immaterial thinking, I discuss mainly the collaborations with other artists. The place of the work is not at the foreground of the discussion. The place of the work is often presented by an institutional context, in the case of the Museum of Sydney. In the case of the film that's discussed that we made around a book of mine, that had a number of different places in Italy and here, but its place in the world of reception, if you like, its political position, its dependence to some degree on conditions external to it, that wasn't greatly discussed. So Material Thinking was a book that obviously attempted to understand the intelligence of material production, and it focused particularly on decision making, the different steps that are made along the way in drawing form out of matter, or of course, as I was arguing, understanding the matter in form, and looking at that relationship as a set of situated activities. But nevertheless, I began to, and I found that certain kinds of, if you like, participatory or associative or concomitant activity through the writing then began to transform themselves into an attitude or a relationship to the project that was non-verbal. So I found myself increasingly in the role of doing dramaturgy, scripting, even performing. So I found myself being progressively drawn in to the very ambience or creative environment that I was seeking to discuss. So there was a balance in the period leading up to that book between observation and reflection and participation and production. But nevertheless, it all held within that initial position of sublime ignorance and a certain curiosity about what the logic might be of these creative processes. And I pulled together some leading criteria that I thought were important for understanding the conditions in which narratives or exegeses about art are relevant to the art process. And I also tried to differentiate between what we as artists might understand to be relevant to the process, something that we wanted to communicate to others as well, from purely circumstantial and retrospective glosses, which is a bit of a temptation in writing about art. And I think there were 3 or 4 kind of headings that I used for that, which I sometimes roll out like a mantra, not entirely remembering quite what they meant, but one of them, which was important to me, was the concept of the forming situation. The forming situation refers to the contract between artists or collaborators or the people in a studio and the context of production. And it probably reflected my, as I say, my kind of weakness or bias to collaboration, in the sense that I frequently respond to an invitation. Writing books is one thing, that tends to be a bit more sort of self-centered, but in terms of an art interest which covers many different areas, it's not likely that you can embark on these projects without there being a corresponding interest, whether it's from an institution or from a community or from a group of artists. But the forming situation also referred to the opportunity. A commission is a classic example of a forming situation. It very rarely comes unencumbered with expectations from the community that's resourcing it and ideally participating in its outcome. So the forming situation is part of what I saw as the distinctiveness of a methodology emerging from creative research. That is to say, the method was bound up with the process. It was iterative. You found out what you wanted to know along the way, and then you staked out your claims in relationship to what you'd found, rather than according to an abstraction. And I mentioned the intelligence of materials, which is, covers a wide range of possibilities, which are sort of discussed in the book. And like a lot of my kind of presentations, the book is ironic. So there's a certain intelligence of materials, but I wanted to try to get us to see that I'm not in this room, I'm sure, but broadly there is often an assumption that materiality has something to do with hardness and form. Whereas, as I was trying to say in the book, the useful materials in the world are combinatory, they are fluid, they don't have edges, they are both finite and infinite. They have all sorts of properties which are absolutely commonplace, and we all understand that. But in terms of an aesthetic assessment of the object, goes completely missing. So a methodology, once again, makes a relationship between the kind of thinking that's appropriate to a process method and the attitude that we have towards the materiality of the world. So that was that sort of phase. And somebody, so material thinking, I'm very depressed about my sort of publications at the moment. No one seems to be buying any of them, so I've brought them all here just so you can see they exist. But just, having said that, material thinking did have a kind of modest success in some obscure corners of the world. And it did generate a proud, you have to put these things where you're trying to sort of get preferment and sort of, you have to show that you've had influence. And it spawned this international journal called the Journal of, Studies in Material Thinking. Yeah. Anyway, so the opening issue of that, Studies in Material Thinking, included a review of material thinking. It was a bit sort of, kind of reflexive, you'd have to say. So presumably, if I'd looked closely enough at that essay, inside it in a little box, there would be a review of the review of the review. So I wasn't sure that it was quite as worldly as we used to say at Deakin. It should have been anyway. Now, the author of that review said, well, this is all very well. It's all very elegant and interesting, and it makes a contribution, because you have to do that. I mean, the idea that you might just try to maintain the status quo, of course, is unimaginable. But you've got to be changing things, even if nobody asked for it. So he said, yes, well, there's clearly elements of change here. It brings together a whole body of work that is now translated into a form that could be useful for creative researchers. But, he said, the difficulty with this is that it doesn't take on what happens to these kinds of process when they go outside the studio or outside the curated environment, which in this case could be a gallery space, or it could be a domestic wall, or some other curated or cared for environment, into the streets. What happens when you take these ideas outside where you've got many, many tiers of language, communication, transportation, timing and spacing, which are, as they say in sort of the investment world, they're externalities. You can't actually control them, but in a certain sense, if you're not engaging with those structures and regimes of living, consumption, participation, and so on, what is the robustness of the method? So, of course, with impeccable logic, I thought, oh, yes, I must respond to this question and see where we go with this. Of course, it was nothing like that, but it was a good question. So what I want to do in my two little case studies with you is show my response to that question. And it takes us into that sort of second part of what I wanted to say. The first part was about sort of insouciance, promiscuity, and ignorance, which was getting this thing going. And the second thing was, okay, what happens when you do reach a sort of provisional thesis about creative research methodology and practice? Is it simply then a tool that allows you to go on doing what you've already done with more confidence, with a longer CV, with more competence in terms of accessing the resources you need in order to to live and make work? Or might it have written into it a transformation? And the transformation would, as I indicated, be possible within a method that wasn't understood as a rigid framework, but in fact might be understood to be like a string figure, a flexible set. If you think of it more like a topology or an internally consistent arrangement that nevertheless is warped, pushed and pulled, activated at different levels according to the circumstance. And such a sense of, if you like, the evolving dialogue would locate the innovation in between the projects. It would locate it somewhere else. And as a working hypothesis, I said that the space, as it were, where it would be located would in fact be something called public space. So obviously you then run into another labyrinth of issues of definition. Do we have public spaces? Who do they belong to? And we can talk about that in terms of political theory. We can talk about that in terms of urban design. We can talk about that in terms of refugees. So what we mean by this and what its symbolic and actual values are is contested territory. But given that is the case, there's absolutely no reason, and indeed that probably is a responsibility, given there are many things we value about public space, that artists should be in there making the case for whatever it is. And we can unfold that a bit. So I deviated then from the earnest task of consolidating my methodology and wrote a little book called Meeting Place, which tried to argue for a performative or everyday version of public space as an event characterized by primary encounter. And I won't go into that book except to say that looking back on it, I can see that in a way I was taking the kind of the kneading, molding, carving, these different modalities of bringing things that are ready for combination but not quite there yet into the social sphere, because the thesis of the book is very much around establishing the protocols of meeting. So it's looking at a relationship that doesn't reside in one side or the other. It's actually, if you like, the combination that produces a third space, or the space of sociability, the space of friendship, the space which allows for new forms of belonging to emerge. So there's a direct relationship I can see now between the theory that informed that book, it's 2 or 3 years old now, and what had gone on earlier in material thinking. It was as if I transposed the material thinking model to the dramaturgy of public space. Anyway, so alongside all of that, I began to think, well, if public space is the tacit or the unspoken dimension within which the kinds of work I'm interested in are occurring, does it in fact exist outside its production? In other words, why would we put ourselves in the role of, for example, public artists working with a given regime? Why would we not instead think that through the symbolic order, we were able to produce the public space that matters for us? It's quite a contorted thought experiment. For most of us, public space is sort of identified with geometrical space, urban space, landscape, and so on. And I was going back to my sort of poetic interests, trying to redefine it as a discursive space. It's actually the space of speech, the space of poetry, the space of dialogue. It's not necessarily mapped very well to an urban setting. I won't take you too far down that track, but the point I was getting at there was that we produce public spaces through our engagement, and our engagement is not necessarily through the prose of the State Department, of the bureaucrats. It's through the full communication that's possible through gesture, through intonation, through the sonority of the voice, through dress, through the cosmetic in its purest sense. That led me to work increasingly with artists whose function was not to produce what we might think of as art, but was in fact to produce public space. So I worked on, again, by invitation really, quite opportunistically. So once again, I was trying to extend a skill set. I'd always, with public space projects that I'd done, like the role I had in the public art down at Fed Square, again, I'd always started from a position of complete ignorance and just not knowing the ropes and just being taught how to do these things, and then beginning to have a contribution of my own. So that was quite a good position to be in when you're working on a very complex project, such as the project I'm just going to talk about briefly. This is the sort of Perth's version of Fed Square, mandated by the current Premier. Yagan Square is going to be a major new hub, I think they always like to use that word, in the centre of the city, and you can imagine all the deliverables it has to meet, connectivity, inclusiveness, sustainability, they go on. Anyway, the Melbourne architecture firm Lyons, who were responsible for the very successful building in Swanston Street, amongst many others, were inviting me to go in with them. Obviously, my weight in this is going to be enormous. I don't know if you want to have me alongside. It's great. Anyway, we won it, and with Aspect Landscape Architects and with colleagues in Perth. And the question arose, for me anyway, was what will be the discourse of this new public space? Will it simply be a kind of receptacle or conduit for various sorts of public performance? Or will there be a closer, we could call it, a material relationship between the production of the space and the meanings that accrue to it? And the relevance of this to this room is that in order to get there, it's necessary to, in a sense, understand such a work as a total artwork, but not in the 19th century sense. So the total artwork is going to involve flows, so flows of human communication, literally how groups and clusters and disperse and come together, so that social choreography. It's also going to look something which very often goes missing when a work or a practice is taken in isolation, even though it may happen internally to the practice, and that is feedback. So the sense in which works are impure, they incorporate noise. They are, in fact, to some degree parasitic on their environment for their sustainability, and they should give something back as well. So that refers to cultural programming. It can refer to choice of materials. It obviously refers to the dialogue that goes on between the different communities who are involved in the development of the site and the design of the site. Now, how do I go forward on this thing? We, or I suppose, proposed a technique for managing this question. I was mentioned before how in material thinking I sort of emphasized the opportunistic. And opportunism is, etymologically what it means is a door opening. But it can be any kind of portal or protocol of meeting. So an opportunity is not simply, a way of continuing on your own path, but rather like the kind of process-based creative research methodology I was talking about, it changes the way you do things. So opportunity compacts time, it produces a sort of conjunction in space. It actually is a place. An opportunity is always a place. And the opportunity that arose in this particular case was, which I liked very much, was centered on the choice of a name. So I've been very interested in place names and how they're fateful for the future. And the West Australian Premier decided that this new square should be called Yagan Square. Yagan was a Noongar man who nowadays we would call him a resistance fighter. So in the very early days of the Swan River colony, he was a thorn in the flesh of the colonial administration. There was a lot of admiration for his courage and his diplomatic skills and all the rest of it, but there was a price on his head. And he was betrayed by two English shepherds and hideously murdered and mutilated. And the Premier decided that the most important new public space in the centre of 21st century Perth, a culture which has an unusually wretched history of apartheid and exclusion of Noongar people from even public space, let alone government, suddenly in this moment of kind of lightning bolt-like change, put this right in the middle. So this was the opportunity. And don't misunderstand me, the opportunity doesn't mean to say you can solve the problem. But what it does, in this case, is opens up what I call a fissure in reality. It suddenly says, this stories, in other words, the discourses of placemaking, which are usually so much about, as they are for a creative research methodology, so much about the resolution of conflict towards some kind of presumed synthesis, obviously wasn't going to work terribly well. So what had also happened, which was just as important, this was an externality that we could have sought, but we could not have controlled, was at the same time the planning authority mandated to carry out this project was instructed to establish meaningful negotiations with the regional Noongar people. And there are negotiations that occur in all our governments around the country at many, many levels with indigenous groups, political, cultural, social. So this was hardly an entire novelty, but what was different about this was that it was led by a very remarkable artist and community elder who had an extraordinary, if you like, creative vision for how the consultation process would be rolled in to creative production. And so there was an unusual convergence of approaches, because I was arguing that in order for this place to have some coherence as a project between projects where different voices, different creativities would now be out there in public space dealing with these externalities, it was necessary to have a string figure. We needed, I felt, to have an elastic set of interconnecting stories or themes which were not necessarily discursive. They could simply be performances, they could be marks on the ground, they could be marks on the body. They would obviously, as this plate indicates, have some relationship to the water country, which is where Yagan Square is located. But above all, what they would do is they would look for commonalities across different cultures and start to use the processes of art making as a method for understanding and incorporating difference into the process of design. This was just one example that came up. So I used that word opportunism. This came up in the context of looking for obviously highly different traditions of casting out, this gesture, which in Noongar culture is associated with informing the spirit of place that you intend to be on his ground. It's a rainbow serpent creature. You would cast something, it could be seeds, whatever's to hand actually, but probably grains of sand. And that gesture is an act of respect. It's very important in the evolution of this, and also another template which we've done since for another site, which I just brought so you can have a look at it, where the encouragement in this process is not to assume meeting, but to restage the possibility of encounter. So in other words, to write the trauma into the very heart of the process, not necessarily to expect a smooth exchange. So this was a good example of that, because this gesture is pre-meeting. It's the gesture that says, okay, this is legitimate access to country. This is something we're all familiar with. When we're introduced to someone, there are protocols before you really meet. And even in our secularized culture, which is very casual often about meeting, we all know that about the unspoken protocols of being on somebody else's emotional patch, and we know we work with that, but it's very rarely reflected in public space. where, for example, and I might say it's often very, very difficult for artists working with the presentation of their work, which has an interiority about it that doesn't necessarily face the world. And we don't necessarily, because of our oculocentric habits, our identification of power and knowledge with seeing, we often overlook the unseen aura around a work, the area of respect. And so a lot of us now try to work with those negative spaces, with shadows, with the post objects and so on, as a way of trying to rebuild that sense of the pre-encounter, which could open up a new way of navigating the world. So we had this gesture. This is actually my son's hand. We did some practice because we hadn't access. I knew very well about this practice. So we just did some stuff of our own down South Coast somewhere. And then I made the obvious connection across to a very different and potentially, in the context of colonization, different sort of meaning of the gesture, which is the casting out of grain into cultivated land, which is the same gesture, but obviously an entirely different agriculture. And a lot of things came out of this when I had the opportunity to be introduced to the Wajak working group, which was the group that was responsible for the consultative process. What came out of it immediately was a sort of relief that we were using creative research methods, quite casual associations, not in an anthropological way, and not to prove any point. So it's like, coming to somebody with your own story, not assuming that they're just going to give you theirs. So I said, look, I don't even know whether it's appropriate to throw this out, but here it is. And I'd already, of course, I talked very carefully to the people who were establishing the day that is this an appropriate thing to show? And there's no problem with that. Just make sure you get it right. But the feedback from that was very, very interesting because in one go, people could see the gesture. And of course, this is the gesture of public space. And it's supremely ambiguous. So it can be a casting out, which is, of course, has very strong biblical associations, this sense of, the Jewish dispersal across, the Middle East. Or, on the other hand, it's the embrace. So it's an absolutely fundamental gesture, but it's oriented. It has a back. It's embodied. So there wasn't a question here of reconciliation, but although I was able to find a very interesting early example of the relationship that developed between Noongar people and particularly Irish immigrants around agriculture, and how there actually was a symbiotic relationship developed quite quickly between particular landholders and the traditional custodians. So they were quite interested in that. Some of the people around the table knew that text, but most of them didn't. We talked in other ways about other elements, but this was one I brought back to them in the second consultation. And the drawing in the middle of it, this kind of in white, was a drawing I did during the first conversation. And they said, I wonder what you were doing, Paul. You didn't seem to be interested in what was going on at all. I said, I just like to draw. So when it came back, I said, that's a mind map of our story so far. And the point about that, it doesn't represent anything beyond a kind of, they say in Italian, un intrecciamento. It's just an entangling, a network of ideas and thoughts. So it tries to capture the, if you like, the creative potential of the dialogue that goes in between projects. We haven't got a project here. We don't even know whether we trust each other enough to do anything together. This was it. And what I did is I put through it a story about fire, where fire had this double meaning in the early colony. On the one hand, it was the Noongar method, of course, of agriculture. On the other hand, the sparks from the scrub clearing, which produced the very pastures that were so appealing to the settlers, produced sparks that tended to get into the thatch of the early cottages and cause them to go up in flames. So that was another quite interesting ambiguity. But we were working poetically with elemental elements, or elemental considerations, obviously mainly around water, earth, and fire. And then we began to find some quite interesting commonalities around the black swan And the Black Swan became, for reasons I won't go into now, an increasingly powerful thought form within that group. And the role that I had was not simply to work, obviously, with this group. There were many other people initiating projects and commissions from that group and beyond, but it's also to work alongside my colleagues, other public artists who've been commissioned to develop ideas, and of course with the architects. So I was looking not only for themes, but also for forms. And I got very interested in looking at interference patterns with the idea of a double source producing increasing complexity as it runs through itself. And we looked at some of the ways in which those forms get extruded into stable objects. We also looked at the relationship between the catenary arc, if you like, the fall of those tiny grains of sand into the water. What kinds of aerial form might they generate? And again, the object here was not to come up with my artwork. I mean, it wasn't to speak literally about what would happen. It was to present figuratively a set of models of a public space emerging as a set of machines, a set of kind of relationships, balances, poises, and to show that there were many precedents across different cultures for that. At that stage, I was able to then to bring in some of my own preoccupations. I always like the resemblance of the tail feathers of the black swan to the edges of burning paper. So then we were able to start talking about the archive and about memory, but I brought that purely through visual connection into a discussion about the real fissure in reality that runs right through the square, which actually is a fault line that runs right down the north-south coast of Western Australia, and it runs right through that site. So that was interesting in terms of beginning to understand that what we were trying to do at Yakin Square was not to bring everybody together, but actually to hold people apart. It's actually to realize that meeting is for later. The real initial issue is encounter, and it's going to depend on quite a lot of desevering. And I use that word advisedly because Yakin was in fact beheaded. So it's not easy territory. Anyway, they quite like the syncline. We all did. And then we got through the swan, and I started to look at the swan string figure, which is a fairly universal, one of millions of string figures that are found. This is the swan string figure, and once again, it's a thought form. It's a way of showing how you hold things together through the tension of holding things apart. I don't think, the word that we came up with for this kind of material thinking in public space, the phrase creative template, probably quite captures it. But what I have done is to emphasize some of the associations of that word template. In some of its associations, it's not a rigid mold. In some of its associations, it actually is a string figure, and the key idea there is the notion of templar. And the templar is the time space of the instant or the opportunity. And the classic moment comes from the technical terminology in bullfighting. And the templar is that moment when the bull and its opponent face each other. And it's a moment that lasts forever, but of course it's instantaneous. It holds open because there's a relationship that cannot be renounced. And hopefully you glide past when it's resolved. But the templar is this, it tries to capture this sense that a public space is in a tense relationship, which is defined by those social flows and by the interactivity between that choreography and the topography. It cannot be collapsed down into a substitutable program. The process we're going through is what we're going to get, and it will be itself the opportunity, something that will be balanced or disbalanced according to the integrity of the work we put in and to the circumstances that allow it. But it wouldn't, as it were, be something else. This is what it is. So then I started to do some drawings over and across and through the emerging lions design, and they're virtually illegible and probably They looked at them with a certain amount of dismay. I then started to overlay some other material which relates to, more specifically, to Jagen's burial site, and just looked at some of the hot spots within that. Did some further kind of sort of Photoshop jobs, just thinking about scales, interference patterns, energy forms that might operate across different scales. There's always in this kind of work, as I think there must be in most of our work, whatever form it takes, there's always an incipient body image. We may not know quite where it is. It might exist in, a memory of a parent, or it might exist in the hollow of a room. But there's usually some sense of energy levels and scales that we carry with us. If this has any merit, it's probably tapping into that sort of stuff. And then finally they say, well, that's all very well, but how would it look if we actually put it over the site? So I just did that sketch. I don't think they found that very helpful either. But anyway, it says actually that's the energy form that comes out of it. And since then, and I won't bore you with it, we've been able to take elements of that arrangement, which is, as you can see, color-coded to indicate different planes, but also different levels of realization into aspects of the design. So the creative template I'm now working with the public artists on the different embodiments, you like, or expressions of it. It's not a top-down thing, and nobody's under any obligation to represent anything in this. It's a sort of energy field, a string figure which has identified certain key relationships. But the point is that embedded within it, although it looks rather abstract, is the potential to return the poetry or the discursive production of public space to the urban design process, which is pretty unusual. So one of the things that came out of this conversation was an opportunity to be involved myself in the public art program. And we made, in fact, a distributed, this is at the end of design development now, so this is a distributed work right across the site. And it refers to a ghost figure, a very important Noongar woman, also a resistance fighter in her own way. And again, this really comes at the invitation of the Whadjuk group. They said, yes, we think that's right, you're doing that the right way, and so on. And so it's a collaboration. There's a very clear understanding that artists have certain métiers and skills, and they will be happily delegated to the artist, whether he or she is indigenous or not. The critical process for them is that they have the authority to mentor, but also to give permission. And of course, ideally in a situation like this, where the topic is essential to their recognition, to have a continuing role in this work. And in fact, just last week I was over there. Hopefully we can now start a process of working with some of the elders to develop a soundscape component to this, which will go in here, and that will deal specifically with memories of Balbuk, who is the woman in question. So anyway, we went through a series of ghost forms with typography, which is the thing I'm interested in. These ghost forms it's a bit Matta Clark-like. They're punched through the buildings, so it's like a ghost just walks straight through the site. Of course, when we started to do this, these are early versions, they've improved greatly, but I just wanted to show you this in terms of method and application. When we started to do this, people we're working for said, well, this is a bit gloomy, having all these ghosts here. I said, it's because Jagen. I mean, what are you going to do? We're going to whitewash it again. Anyway, so they didn't want the word ghost. They said, no, ghost was too dark, my original name. So we ended up with something that was much more bland called passenger, but we'll get it back in somehow. So it was just a little trajectory. Now, the reason for taking you through that case study is to illustrate what appears to me the potential of creative research methodology when it's understood as a transformative process. In other words, the feedback never gets you back, of course, to where you began. You find on the way through that a lot of the stuff you've forgotten becomes relevant again, but also you acquire new levels of complexity. Now that complexity in my case is not carried in my head, it's in the dramaturgy of the situation. So more and more players get involved, and as that happens, less and less of what you thought survives, and it becomes increasingly anonymous and public. So what I've done, I've just brought artifacts for you because I'm really keen on sales. And this little book, which has just come out, just talks about that particular aspect of the feedback loop. So it's called Turbulence, and it's just a little book of which talks about, I guess, creative method and design in the context of complex situations where you don't have control, and indeed where you don't actually know, you can't know what the outcome will be. What is the heuristic? What is the knowledge value, if you like, of processes which are multi-actor without a clear destination? And of course it's a question that afflicts all universities who want to support that kind of open-ended research at a time when our governments prefer us to tell us in advance what the outcome is going to be. And this is the book that captures the Yagan Square story, and it's also all the public space projects that came out of material thinking up to this. And it has in its subtitle a neologism, a new word, which is a word I made up, partly because I always like to put one new word in every book. I think this is quite nice, and I think if nobody else reads it, it always gets quite good on the web. I've invented this term choreotopography, and I'm rather hoping that by now it should immediately make sense. So choreotopography is the sequel to material thinking. So when material thinking is taken out into the public domain, you find that there is an endless feedback loop between choreography, which is the social flow and intercourse of people, and the topography, which, as you'll gather, in my view, topography is not simply the physical space, the urban space, it's the memory space. It's the space of that endless dialogue that we maintain with our surroundings and with each other, and of course in our own heads. Choreotopography allows back in, I hope, a much more sophisticated and also common sense understanding of the multisensory, which is not all about just us as consumers or behavioral robots. It's actually about the endless feedback across the senses and between those senses and sense forming. So choreotopography tries to reinvigorate sense of place in much the same way that material thinking tried to reinvigorate the sense of the work of art. Oh, and by the way, as a footnote, we've been doing a sequel to that Yagan Square project, which this one I didn't talk about partly because I'm superstitious. This one is just in process at the moment, but this is a document that has been prepared along the same lines for artists or with artists and communities around particular opportunities that have emerged. This is for a coastal suburb just outside Scarborough, and the same thing's happening with this one. It's now generating forms, it's generating programs, it's generating, we hope, a new sense of belonging for a diverse set of communities, international, regional, local, which will translate into forms of sustainability of various kinds. Also, it's fun. There's a lot of fun in that. It's a sort of creative project. So thank you. That's it.